Cool. So thanks a lot for joining, Liam. I wanted to get some engineering context from about some of the work we've been doing on policies. I think like the status of this is Matei and I are really trying to answer this question of like how we solve for fine-grained permissions in GitLab and iterate on that. Because our current role-based access control system is a little bit too broad for especially enterprise customers. So we've had a number of conversations with customers and users. We've learned a little bit more about the problem space. But I think the question that we're trying to answer kind of here is like, what direction from an engineering standpoint kind of makes sense? Because we have a couple of different directions we can kind of go in. So like what we're hearing from customers is really just a need for, at the user level, to restrict what people can do. And the most common use case is really around separation of duties, where like the person who merges to master or opens like a merge request can't also be the person that reviews it, merges it, etc. And the person that merges it can't also be the person who deploys it to production. So you want like people that are specifically ops folks that are just responsible for environment management. And so like maintaining that separation and that boundary is really important. And I think like the other thing that we're hearing is like some things are more important than others. So like the threshold at which people can operate under like is going to be different for like the monorepo that is like all of our most important like production application versus, oh, I'm a developer, I just like created a project, it's my own thing, I'm the only member. So like the differences there and what we can do are like going to be different, those two. Or like obviously the former has a very high bar for what people can do. So it looks like you talked a little bit about custom roles. Did you want to just voice over some of the like points that you kind of made here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of the approach that we spoke about, so the kind of like almost the first iteration being how do we try and follow what we currently have, but allow kind of like a new role which can have kind of like custom actions allowed in it. I think that probably is the most sensible first iteration. But I think there are some kind of like difficulties or considerations in doing that. So in terms of how our role-based setup currently works, it's quite, I would say it's fairly naive in terms of we have the 5 different roles that we support from guest to owner, and each one of those roles is assigned a number. And then as far as like the experience I have and have seen in the code base, I think we kind of have 2 different ways of using those roles. So I think to the point where I think in our doc, you've talked about the can method. So that comes from a gem called can, which is quite a well-known Ruby library. And I think we use that a lot around, like we have a class called group policy. And a group policy, basically, it almost does what I've talked about in this document, where it identifies a role, and within that role, it talks about kind of what all of the actions are that are supported in there. And the role levels, as I said, it's kind of hierarchical. So every role has all of the access of all of the roles sort of lower than it in that chain as well. So basically, when we have an action at the moment, what will happen is we'll say this action is happening, it's restricted. Does the user who, and at that point of the action, will basically say you have to be, for example, a maintainer or above. Is the user a maintainer or above or not? And what we also have, so aside from the group policy, where it actually talks about a role and what all of the actions are within that role, I know we have other parts of the code base where it directly sets the expectation of what a role should be. So it almost does it the other way. So it kind of says, like, you want to execute this action, you have to be a maintainer or above. Let me look at what the user is. Now, obviously, the reason this is difficult to kind of build on top of is what we want to basically be doing is making sure everywhere in the code base that says, instead of saying, I want to check for a role, it basically says, this is the action I'm trying to execute. And then it basically sees whether the role that user is assigned has that action within it. And I guess if we're then talking about what a custom role looks like, a role just becomes a list of actions. And you can kind of take away the hierarchy, maybe to an extent. It'll probably make sense if we have some specific logic to maintain what we currently have in terms of kind of like reporters, developers, et cetera, et cetera. But it would allow you to create a role which almost had like a combination of various different actions that the role support at the moment. So not everything would always have to be kind of hierarchical. and you could kind of pick and choose the actions that you want to be able to create your own roles.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. So that actually doesn't sound as horrible as like I thought, since we already have like these, like we already check on specific actions. So I guess that we already have can which can help. So we would so the other thing that I mentioned in the doc that we would have to do is um, like the hierarchy and role inheritance that also need to change, I'd assume as well, because like if we are moving away from like a hierarchical role kind of perspective and towards like hard code, like I'd have to think about how, because right now roles inherit downwards as well. So like if you're in a group, like your highest role will always apply, and there are certain features like, for instance, confidential issues, for instance, where it's like reporters and hire are the only ones that can actually see like a particular issue. So I think we'd also need to track down every single feature that has to kind of like deal with role inherit, like hierarchical roles, and then consider how that changes.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree. So I think that's definitely one part, and the other part is try to figure out the inconsistencies between where we use that group policy class, which I think is quite well defined how a role works, and then whether it's kind of more sort of like sporadic throughout the code base, where we just kind of check in directly to see which role a user is.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit of a cleanup around both of those things. But ultimately, I think the concept of a custom role almost is just like what I think of as a policy. So it's a role with a bunch of actions that you select you want to kind of be available. So I think it does make sense as kind of like a first iteration.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? I wasn't clear.
Oh, sorry, did I break up?
No. I just don't know, because you said policy and the first iteration. I wasn't clear what that.
Yeah,
was.
so I think to me, like customizable roles, the way that I think of what a policy is, I think almost like a customizable role is almost a policy. So a policy basically is if you think about it in terms of like the IAM setup, it's a set of rules to kind of allow a bunch of actions to happen. And I think with a customizable role, that's almost what it becomes. It's basically within that role, you can kind of check all of the actions that you want to be able to happen. It gives you kind of then complete control over all of the actions that we state.
Right. I think that like the difference to me is like when I think of a role, it's like this is the default set of permissions that I get on a consistent basis on like everything that I can interact with. Like I think the policy, like what I think is interesting is like it's not applied to users, it's applied to resources, where like I can put a policy on a project, and so that constrains like has the like what I should be able to do as like as a maintainer or whatever. So like that's why I thought that like going into the so the other thing that we were talking about was like team-based permissioning, which I think is like not a great solution. It introduces like a lot of complexity with some limitations. But like the reason that I thought that policies was interesting in like the way that you describe it in the issue is that like ideally like I'd like to lead like again like tell me if I'm wrong here, but like making changes to the role system is in my mind really hard and sensitive because it's so well baked into the GitLab application. And if there's an edge case that we miss, then we accidentally expose something like on a self-managed instance or on gitlab.com. There's some really sensitive and hard change. It's going to be challenging for enterprises. So like that's why I was thinking policies is always like a layer that like sits on top that we can just build and iterate on and leave the role system basically alone. And the idea here is like you wrote in the issue, maybe there's like JSON or like a policy that you can say like, here's my policy where like that, an owner can't delete a project. And, for the like sensitive, mono repo that like our company is really dependent on, I'm going to apply that policy to that project. So, if an owner goes to that project, we'll have to consider how the user experience kind of like looks and feels like. Maybe, and to be able to explain like, why can't I delete this project as an owner? I should be able to do this. Maybe we explain this to like, this project is like a custom policy that's being applied. Click on this and you can see kind of the rule set that's like being applied and, how to get around it. But like, that's like why this has been interesting to me. is I feel like it like isn't a boring solution to a certain degree, but it does like de-risk things, and in my mind makes the engineering path a little bit more iterative, because we can just build on this thing, we can MVC something, it doesn't have to be perfect, and we're not like radically making things less secure if we kind of like need to iterate on it. But like, what do you think about that? Or do you feel like it's too complicated, still not a boring solution, we shouldn't go in that direction?
So I didn't think of it from that direction initially. So I think that's quite interesting. So I'll probably need some time to kind of to take that in. I think the way that I was thinking of it was and I think you've actually made a couple of really good arguments there in terms of like de-risking it. And the way that I was thinking about it was that the kind of like the initial rollout of policies is we create some default policies which replicate our current kind of role. So it has all of those permissions, and then you can basically just assign those to users. And that's basically step one. So step one is that you can assign a policy to a user. You can't assign it to a project or anything like that. The pros there from an engineering point of view is it kind of creates and sets an architecture in terms of the direction that we want to move in, and ensures that when we then allow you to also assign policies to projects or other resources, everything's consistent. Now, the downsides, I think, are actually like hearing your point there. I think the downsides are maybe greater than that, in that you're right, by changing something that already exists, naturally introduces some risk, and it's obviously a really critical part of the system. It also means that the very kind of initial piece of work is primarily going to be for kind of engineering benefit rather than customer benefit. So right. The outcome isn't going to be much different, right? All you're able to do is kind of have this concept of custom roles. You're not allowed to kind of add any kind of like specific permissions on projects and things like that. So yeah, that's quite interesting. I guess I'll have to think a bit more about kind of the power or kind of like the complexity, or what it would look like from an engineering point of view if you was to start applying policies to projects.
Yeah. Like that's just my thought. Like when I was thinking about like the build path forward for custom roles, like I'm thinking like, how are we going to build this thing kind of in parallel and not mess up our existing role system? Because we're not going to get it all done in a release. Like this is a complicated. So we have to feature flag this. We're building this kind of system in parallel and trying to leave like our role system alone until we're really confident that we've tracked down all the edge cases. We've like tracked down and have like a solid way of like our hierarchical features, like being able to manage that. Our documentation's a mess because now we have like two kind of like paths depending on like which, because we want to test this with customers. So like, I'm not sure how we handle that. But with policies, at least in an ideal world, we can get something helpful out in one or two releases. Because like, again, the very specific use cases that I've heard are around like separation of duties. Like I want to have like separation there for certain projects. It could be a subset, it could be all projects, but managing things like project deletion, which has been like a sensitive topic lately. And for some stuff like my production like my project, my mono repo, that's like my crown jewels for my company, I probably like maybe would never want to delete it. Like that's kind of the way that I was thinking about that. And I don't know, it seems to have some benefits going for it, and that would kind of just like let us leave the role stuff alone. And if there's a path in the future where policies become so evolved that like we could consider like it's substituting kind of for our role system, with the kind of like the AWS style like graphical interface where it's like really easy to kind of make your own policies and like apply them to users and groups and LDAP, that's totally something we can iterate towards. But that's a project that's going to be like a year long. So
okay. No, I think that makes sense. I think we should pick one or two of the most important kind of scenarios here then, and then try and iterate from there. And I think, as you say, it's achievable. Like if as you say, it's as simple as we create one almost hard-coded policy which allows you to kind of like decide whether or not a project can be deleted or something like that. I think it's a first step, and yeah, we can kind of see where we go from there. So yeah, I think that does make sense. I think
Okay.
the bit that I haven't figured out yet is what you touched on at the beginning, was around almost like the multi-factor stuff or the multi-step stuff. So whereby you might want multiple people to, for example, as you say, like you want to create configuration or customization around how many people have to accept a merge request, or as you said, the same person who created the merge request can't be the one that merges it, and things like that. I think it'll be interesting to kind of think about what a policy would look like to kind of enforce some of that behavior. I think when I've seen stuff like that on projects before, it hasn't necessarily been done via kind of like a common policy model, but that's not to say that it can't be. And I think if we could do that, that could make it really powerful.
Well, I think that, you get around that, but in my mind, like this is where groups kind of come in, where, I think that, we have like merge request approvers at the merge request level. And the way that they do that is to say like, well, the person that merges this or approves this, has to be in this particular group. You have to get like two approvers from this group of people. So I think that like, I'll have to think about, the JSON snippet that you like provided, but like in my mind, being able to apply policy to like a project to say like the people that, are performing this action have to be in this particular group, or they have to be a member of this. So that way it works really nicely with like LDAP group sync and so forth. So where you can say like, if someone from operations joins, like they immediately get dumped into this because they're an Active Directory, they get provisioned into this group. And that person has to be the person that like is responsible for deploying for deploying a change to production by nature of them being in that group. So I think that like there's ways of getting around it. The challenge is still like, one of the challenges is like the user experience. Is like, how do you explain to the user and how do we document that like, oh well, like here's the default things that you should be able to do, but in like EE, if you have policies, then like that could totally change. And like here's kind of like, that might not be as big of a deal as I'm kind of thinking it is in my mind, but I think it's something for Matei and I to kind of like put our heads together and figure out.
No, I think that makes sense. Yeah, I think policies work for like allowing or denying an action on a resource, and you can kind of like extend that to saying whether that individual is part of like a group or a team or whatever. I think having it based on like some event that's happened prior can be a lot more difficult. But no, you're right. And I think talking about how we explain it to users, I think by starting with policies kind of like attached to projects, you allow it to be kind of like an enterprise feature that not everyone has to worry about. Whereas if you replace kind of our user roles with policies, that's something that, okay, you could get the user experience right, so it's really simple and looks the same as what we have now, but ultimately it's going to affect everyone.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that was something that I meant to mention earlier, which is like, if we do this, we can't have CE and EE have different role systems. Like they have to, yeah. Like there's no way that there's just complexity is just too nuts. Yeah. But with this approach, like we can say like, our RBAC works great for 80%, but for the 20%, we have this layer that just sits on top, and that's an EE feature.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. I think it'll be interesting to explore then, like what you can't do, or maybe what problems this doesn't solve, and kind of like having more granular roles would solve instead.
Yeah.
Such as kind of like if you look at the permission setup in the documentation, kind of where you might want somebody to be a maintainer minus one of the sort of the permissions that they have. I guess it's kind of like how do we then do that? And maybe that is like the customizable roles is the only way to get there, I guess.
Yeah, right. I'll have a think on that. I think it's helpful because like all the 99% of the needs that I hear about are people that, want to restrict what roles can do. They don't want to take like a maintainer and then give them 6 to 8 different privileges that, put them close to an owner. They want to take like what a maintainer can do and then reduce it. They want to take what an owner can do and remove like the ability to delete things and like in an unrecoverable state. So cool. I'll have a think on that. I think this was really helpful for me, like just hearing your opinion, and like again the idea of attaching like a policy to a project or a group as opposed to like a particular user, I think that's it's gratifying to hear you think that has some legs. So
Yeah, I definitely do. I think it sounds like a relatively straightforward first iteration as well.
okay, cool. Thanks a lot.
Awesome.
All good. I guess we can leave it there then. Thanks a lot
Perfect.
for hearing me out.
No, that's good. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for the time.
Cheers. Thanks, man.
Cheers.